I thought I'd found heaven. A forgotten 1920s log cabin deep in the woods, waiting for someone like me to bring it back to life. For the first few weeks, it was pure peace. Then the letters started coming. The Lakeview Pines HOA fined me for everything. The color of my tarp, the placement of my dumpster, even a single drop of oil on my driveway. At first, I tried to cooperate, until I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. They wanted me to bow. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every threat, every lie, every fake violation. And when I found an old county record buried in a dusty file cabinet, I discovered a secret that would completely destroy their authority. So when I walked into that final HOA meeting, they thought they'd already won. But I wasn't there to apologize. I was there to end them. The two of them stood just past my property line, right at the edge of an ancient split-rail fence that was more of a suggestion than a barrier. One guy was thin and wiry, clutching a clipboard to his chest like a shield. The other was built like a refrigerator, arms crossed, with a completely unreadable expression. They were wearing these cheap-looking matching polyester shirts with a little embroidered logo, Lakeview Pines Community Security. The logo, a cartoonish pine tree next to a placid-looking lake, was hilariously at odds with the gravity they were trying to project. "You can't be here," the clipboard guy announced, his voice a little too high, cracking on the last word. "This is a formal stop work order. You need to cease all activity on this structure immediately." I just stood there, on my own land, holding a piece of century-old Douglas fir that I'd just spent an hour sanding to a perfect silken finish. The air smelled of history, of sawdust, sun-warmed pine needles, and the clean, damp scent of the lake drifting through the trees. It was the smell of a dream finally coming to life. The kind of deep, fulfilling satisfaction you can only get from building something with your own two hands. And these two guys, in their cheap shirts and their even cheaper authority, were trying to turn it into a nightmare. For a second, I just saw red. A hot, blinding flash of fury that made my knuckles white on the piece of wood I was holding. Who were they to tell me what I could and couldn't do on my own property? Who gave them the right to march onto my land and give me orders, as if they were marshals and I was some common outlaw? I imagined heaving the heavy plank of fur at them, just to wipe the smug certainty off their faces. But I took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed the anger down. It wouldn't help, not yet. I'd been expecting this. Not them, specifically, but this moment, this confrontation. It was where this whole thing had been heading for months. A slow-motion train wreck I was powerless to stop, but not powerless to prepare for. They thought they had me. They thought their clipboard and their empty threats were enough to make me pack up my tools and just quit. They saw me as a problem, an outsider who didn't play by their precious, arbitrary rules. They looked at my project, a painstaking revival of a piece of local history, and saw nothing but a violation. They thought they had me cornered, another nail to be hammered down, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know that my patience, worn thin by their incessant harassment, had finally hardened into something else entirely. They didn't know I'd been spending my nights not just sleeping, but poring over documents that were decades older than their entire Homeowners Association. They didn't know that their own rulebook, the one they waved around like a weapon, held the very secret that was about to undermine their entire rotten foundation. To understand how we got here, and how I turned their own intimidation tactics back on them with glorious, crushing precision, we have to go back to the beginning. It had always been the dream. Not the white picket fence dream, not the two-car garage and the manicured lawn. My dream was quieter, rougher around the edges. A dream made of wood, stone, and solitude. I'm a carpenter by trade, a restorer of things people have given up on. For years, I'd been making a living bringing other people's forgotten furniture and dilapidated houses back to life. all while socking away every spare dollar for a project of my own. I wanted a place that was truly forgotten, a structure with a story etched into its grain, a place that needed me as much as I needed it. For 2 years, my search became an obsession. I wasn't just scrolling through real estate apps. I was a hunter. My weekends were spent driving down unpaved county roads, my truck kicking up dust on trails that hadn't seen traffic in years. I explored overgrown paths, pushing through thorny bushes in search of a glimpse of a roofline. I dove into the obscure corners of the internet, sifting through county auction sites and historical society archives. I was looking for a ghost. The journey was discouraging. I saw a dozen false hopes. There was the cabin near a beautiful creek, but its foundation had been washed out, leaving it hanging precariously over a gully. A project for an engineer, not a carpenter. There was another, a classic A-frame deep in the woods, that looked perfect from the outside. Inside, it was a horror show of 80s renovation, its rustic charm buried under layers of vinyl siding, popcorn ceilings, and shag carpet that smelled faintly of mildew and regret. I met a seller who showed me a fixer-upper that turned out to be a collapsed pile of rotten logs that was more firewood than house. I was starting to lose hope, wondering if the kind of authentic, untouched history I was searching for had been completely erased from the modern world. And then I found it. It wasn't even a proper listing. It was a footnote in an estate sale, vaguely described as outbuilding on wooded acreage. Tucked away on a lot so dense with trees it was nearly invisible from the road, was a cabin. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, primal. The listing's sparse details said it was built in the 1920s by a fur trapper, and it looked it. A thick blanket of moss covered the weathered stone chimney. The hand-split cedar shakes on the roof were curled and gray with age, and the whole structure had a slight, weary lean, like an old man settling into his favorite chair for a long nap. But the bones were magnificent. I pushed aside a curtain of ivy to see the foundation, solid granite stones pulled from the land itself, fitted together with masterful precision. The main logs were massive, hand-hewn timbers, their axe marks still visible, the kind of old-growth wood you just can't find anymore. I peered through a grimy, wavy glass window, and my breath caught. The interior was dominated by a giant stone fireplace that took up an entire wall, a hearth big enough to stand in. It was a complete disaster. It was perfect. It was everything I was looking for. The property was part of a larger, loosely defined community called Lakeview Pines. The realtor, a cheerful woman who seemed more interested in a quick commission than the details, mentioned an HOA but waved it off dismissively. "Oh, them," she'd said. "They mostly just handle road maintenance and the community dock. For a property this isolated, you'll barely know they exist." Famous last words. I spent hours walking the property that first day, the realtor long gone. The cabin sat on a small rise overlooking the lake, the water visible as a shimmer of blue and silver through the dense pines. The quiet was profound, broken only by the cry of a loon and the whisper of the wind. It was a sanctuary. It was a place where I could pour all my skill, my passion, and my savings into creating something real and lasting. The moment I finally got the keys in my hand, feeling their cold, solid weight, was one of the best of my life. I had my project. I had my dream. I had no idea of the shadow that was already gathering at the edges. That first month was pure magic. It was a period of discovery, of getting to know the soul of the place. I spent the first few days just sweeping, clearing out decades of accumulated dust, leaves, and the detritus of nesting animals. As I cleared the floor, I uncovered the original wide plank floorboards, scarred and stained but incredibly solid. I spent an entire weekend just clearing thick brush and saplings away from the foundation, allowing the old stone to breathe and dry out for the first time in years. It felt like I was performing an act of kindness for the house itself. Behind the massive fireplace, I found a hidden pantry, its door perfectly camouflaged in the log wall. Inside were a few old tin cans, a brittle, yellowed newspaper from October 1938 with headlines about the coming war in Europe, and a small, hand-carved wooden bird. I held it in my palm, imagining the trapper who had lived here, carving this small object during a long, lonely winter. Every little discovery felt like a handshake across time, a connection to the past that made the project feel less like construction and more like a conversation with ghosts. The work was physically brutal, but spiritually satisfying. My first major task was stabilizing the structure. The front porch roof was sagging dangerously, so I spent a week carefully jacking it up, inch by painful inch. I replaced the rotted support posts with new cedar I milled myself on site, shaping them with hand tools to match the original rustic aesthetic. I climbed onto the main roof, a treacherous landscape of broken shakes, and patched it with a temporary, but completely watertight, heavy-duty tarpaulin to keep the elements out, while I planned the permanent restoration. I rented a large dumpster, placed it as discreetly as I could at the end of the long gravel driveway, and began the slow process of hauling out the debris of long neglect: rotted wood, broken glass, and crumbling plaster. It was a slow, methodical process. I was in no rush. This wasn't a job with a deadline. It was a passion project. I wanted to honor the cabin's original craftsmanship, to use materials and techniques that the original builder would have recognized. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch, nursing a cold beer, my muscles aching in the best possible way, and watch the sunset paint the lake in hues of orange and purple. A profound sense of peace settled over me. I was a million miles away from the noise and demands of the city. This was my world now. When I bought the place, I'd done what I thought was my due diligence and skimmed the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CCNRs. It was a thick, dense document full of legalese, but it seemed like standard stuff about keeping properties tidy. Noise ordinances and rules for new construction. Nothing in it seemed to apply directly to the historical restoration I was doing. My interpretation of the rules was simple: don't be a nuisance and don't build anything tacky. I could live with that. In my mind, I was improving an eyesore, a derelict building that was a blot on the landscape. I figured any HOA, any neighbor, would be thrilled. The thought of them becoming a problem barely crossed my mind. I was living the dream, naive enough to think everyone would be happy for me. The first sign of trouble wasn't a bang, but the rustle of a cream-colored, fancy-looking envelope in my otherwise empty mailbox. The Lakeview Pines HOA logo was embossed in the corner, elegant and official. I opened it, assuming it was a welcome letter, perhaps with information about trash pickup schedules or the code for the community boat ramp. Instead, it was a friendly reminder. The title was cheerful, but the message underneath was a cold slap in the face. It was a notice of violation. My crime, the color of my roof tarp, apparently deep blue, as they called it, was not on the pre-approved list of acceptable colors for temporary structural coverings. The letter went on to mention that my dumpster, which I thought was well hidden, was partially visible from a bend in the community hiking trail and had to be completely screened from view within 7 days to avoid a fine. It also noted a minor fluid leak on my gravel driveway, likely a drop of oil from my truck, which was a violation of the community's pavement and ground covering maintenance standards. I read it 3 times, my initial confusion curdling into annoyance. It felt like a joke, a piece of satire from a sitcom. A friendly reminder? It was a warning shot, pure and simple. I was in the midst of a massive project, single-handedly saving a derelict building from collapsing into the earth, and they were worried about the color of a temporary tarp and a single oil stain? I felt a hot prickle of indignation. This was bureaucracy at its most absurd and pointless. Still, I was the new guy. I understood the politics of small communities. I didn't want to start a war before I'd even met my neighbors. So, with a heavy sigh and a string of muttered curses, I complied. I drove 40 minutes back to the hardware store and bought a massive drab brown tarp that met their earth tone requirement. I spent another hour wrestling the new tarp onto the roof. Then I spent the better part of a Saturday, time I had planned to use for restoring the cabin's windows, building a ridiculous, oversized wooden screen around the dumpster. It looked like a small fortress and was far more of an eyesore than the dumpster itself had ever been, but it met the letter of their law. I even went out and scrubbed the oil spot on the gravel with a wire brush and degreaser. It felt like a total waste of time and energy, but I did it. I was trying to be a good neighbor. Then, to show good faith, I decided to be proactive. I thought that maybe the issue was that they didn't understand my vision. I spent the next week of evenings hunched over my drafting table, creating a complete set of restoration plans. I drew up detailed architectural drawings, compiled material specs, and even included a landscaping plan featuring native plants that would complement the natural environment. I wanted to be utterly transparent. I wanted to show them that my vision for the cabin was tasteful, historically sensitive, and would ultimately be a beautiful asset to the community. I bundled it all together with a polite, carefully worded cover letter, explaining my deep respect for the cabin's history and my commitment to a high-quality restoration. I mailed the entire package to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, ARC, for their information and approval. I wasn't just fixing a cabin. I was extending an olive branch. I sealed the heavy envelope, confident that once they saw the professionalism and quality of my plans, they'd understand my intent and leave me alone. I could not have been more wrong. That olive branch was about to be set on fire and thrown back in my face. 2 weeks later, another one of those cream-colored envelopes appeared in my mailbox. This one felt heavier, thicker, and my stomach clenched as I picked it up. My detailed plans, the ones I had labored over, the ones that represented the culmination of my dream, were rejected. It wasn't just a rejection. It was a cold, impersonal dismissal delivered via a form letter. The attached sheet listed the reasons, a checklist of bureaucratic nonsense. Proposed roofing materials, hand-split cedar shakes, are not on the approved list of materials. See Appendix B, approved shingles, asphalt, composite. Proposed window design, custom milled. Historically accurate wood frames, does not conform to community standards for fenestration. See Guideline 14C, approved window styles, vinyl, aluminum clad. They even flagged my plan to repoint the original stone chimney with historically appropriate mortar as a violation, stating that any exterior masonry must use pre-approved, uniformly colored modern mortar mix. The final line was a gut punch that left me breathless. The overall scope of the restoration is deemed out of character with the modern and cohesive vision of the Lakeview Pines community. I stared at the words, my disbelief turning into a slow, hot burn of rage. Modern and cohesive vision? They wanted me to put asphalt shingles and cheap, plastic-looking vinyl windows on a 100-year-old log cabin. They weren't just misguided. They were demanding that I actively desecrate a historic building. The approved materials list they sent along was a nightmare of plastic siding, faux stone veneers, and cookie-cutter fixtures better suited for a soulless suburban tract home development. It was the architectural equivalent of demanding a classical sculptor use Play-Doh. That's when I saw the signature at the bottom of the letter, printed in an elegant, sharp cursive. Carol Aldridge, President, Lakeview Pines HOA, and head of the Architectural Review Committee. In that moment, it all clicked into place. This wasn't about rules or community standards. This was about power, one person's power. Carol was the self-appointed queen of this little kingdom, the arbiter of taste, and my authentic historical cabin was an affront to her sterile, uniform world. My dream wasn't just a violation. It was a threat to her absolute control. This wasn't feedback. It was a declaration of war. The olive branch I had so carefully extended had been snapped in two and used to poke me in the eye. Fine, I thought, a cold resolve settling over me. If it's a fight they want, it's a fight they'll get. My project was no longer just about restoration. It was now about resistance. My first move was to try and reason with them. I was still clinging to the naive hope that if I could just explain my position logically and passionately, they'd see how ridiculous this all was. I composed a long, detailed email to Carol Aldridge and the entire ARC. I didn't just state my opinion. I provided evidence. I attached photographs of historically significant cabins from the region, all of which used the exact hand-split cedar shakes and custom wood windows I was proposing. I included a letter from a local architecture professor specializing in historical preservation, who called my restoration approach a model of sensitive and appropriate historical restoration. I laid out my case with precision and passion, explaining that forcing me to use modern materials would not only destroy the cabin's historical value, but would, ironically, create a far greater eyesore than the authentic restoration I had planned. The reply came less than 24 hours later. It was brutally concise. 2 sentences. Thank you for your correspondence. The committee's decision, as previously stated, is final. It was signed, of course, by Carol. The cold, arrogant dismissal was infuriating. It was a digital pat on the head. They hadn't addressed a single one of my points. They hadn't looked at my evidence. They just stonewalled me. So I tried again, rephrasing my arguments. And again, this time appealing to the long-term property value of a genuinely restored historic home. Each time I was met with the same robotic, infuriating refusal. The rules are the rules. The CC&Rs are legally binding documents. Your compliance is required. Then the fines started, arriving like clockwork in their cream-colored envelopes. The first was for $100 for continuing unapproved structural alterations. I was doing essential, non-aesthetic work to keep the cabin from collapsing on itself, but in their eyes, every nail I hammered was an act of defiance. A week later, another fine arrived, this time for $250. My crime? A neatly stacked pile of salvaged lumber from the cabins. Interior was deemed an unsightly accumulation of construction materials. Then came a $50 fine for an oil stain. On my gravel driveway, no bigger than my hand, the very spot I had already scrubbed. It was a clear strategy of harassment by 1,000 cuts, designed to bleed me dry financially and crush my will to continue. I started to feel like I was being pecked to death by chickens. That's when I started my own documentation. I went out and bought a heavy-duty 3-ring binder and a box of plastic sleeves. I created a file. Every threatening email, every terse reply, every fine notice. It all went in, dated and meticulously organized. I started taking photographs of my supposed violations. The neat stack of wood, the clean patch of gravel, the sturdy, board-approved brown tarp. If they were building a case against me, I was going to build a better, more truthful one against them. I also pulled out that thick, intimidating copy of the CC&Rs and started really reading it, not just skimming. I sat at my makeshift table in the cabin with a highlighter in one hand and a legal dictionary open on my laptop. For hours each night, I waded through the dense, convoluted language. Most of it was boilerplate nonsense, but I started noticing inconsistencies, vague definitions, and clauses that seemed to contradict each other. I had a growing feeling that I was looking for a needle in a haystack. But something told me to keep digging. This document was their Bible, the source of all their power. To beat them, I had to know it better than they did. Feeling increasingly isolated and under siege, I decided it was time to see if I had any potential allies. My first stop was an older gentleman named Bill, whose property bordered mine to the east. He was out tending to a magnificent rose garden when I approached. When I explained the situation with the ARC and the fines, his friendly face clouded over. "Ah, you've met Carol," he said with a long, weary sigh. "Son, my advice is to just give in. Save yourself the headache. It's not worth the fight." He told me a soul-crushing story about how the ARC had dragged him through 6 months of reviews just to build a small greenhouse for his wife, demanding changes to everything from the angle of the roof to the brand of the hinges on the door. He eventually gave up on the project entirely. "She lives for this stuff," Bill said, gesturing vaguely toward the center of the community. "It's a power trip. You can't win." My next attempt was with a younger couple down the road, who lived in a brand-new house with a lawn so perfect it looked like a green carpet. They were a brick wall. "We chose this community specifically because of the high standards," the husband said stiffly, standing with his arms crossed on his perfectly manicured lawn. "The rules protect our investment." The wife nodded in agreement, adding, "An unapproved, ramshackle restoration project could bring down everyone's property values." They saw me not as a neighbor trying to save a piece of history, but as a direct threat to their financial portfolio. After talking to 4 other homeowners, the response was depressingly consistent, a toxic cocktail of fear and Kool-Aid. Most residents were clearly intimidated by Carol and the board, recounting their own smaller skirmishes over things like mailbox designs and the color of their front doors. A few, like the perfect lawn couple, were her biggest fans, true believers in the gospel of conformity. I walked back to my cabin that evening, feeling more alone than ever. This wasn't a community. It was a fiefdom, ruled by a petty tyrant and her loyal courtiers. Just as I was about to call it a day, lost in my gloomy thoughts, a beat-up old Ford truck slowed to a stop on the road beside my driveway. A woman in her late 60s, with a deeply weathered face and sharp, intelligent eyes, rolled down her window. "You're the guy with the trapper's cabin, right?" she asked, her voice raspy but kind. I nodded, wary of another lecture. "Name's Margaret," she said. "Lived here 30 years, long before this HOA got its teeth. Don't let that Aldridge woman push you around. She's a snake in the grass, always has been." She gave me a cryptic, conspiratorial smile. "I heard you're having trouble. You should go to the county records office. Don't bother with the HOA's maps or the documents they give you. Look at the original survey plats from when the county first zoned this land back in the 60s. Might find something interesting." With that, she gave a short nod, rolled up her window, and drove off, leaving me in a cloud of dust and a flicker of newfound hope. A clue. It was the first real one I had. The confrontation happened on a bright, cool Saturday. I was making good progress on reinforcing the main cabin floor, my mind constantly circling back to what Margaret had said. The original survey plats. I hadn't had a chance to get to the county seat yet, but a plan was beginning to form in the back of my mind, a seed of an idea that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I was so focused on my work, leveraging a new support beam into place, that I didn't hear the car pull up until the doors slammed shut with unnecessary force. I looked up, muscles tensed, and saw them. Clipboard guy and refrigerator guy, striding through the trees in their ridiculous security shirts as if they were on a mission of great importance. They didn't hesitate at the property line. They marched right onto my land, stopping about 20 feet from where I was working. "Mr. Jensen?" Clipboard guy asked, though he obviously knew who I was. His tone was officious, trying for authority, but landing on nasally. "I am," I said, setting my pry bar down slowly and deliberately. I kept my voice calm and level, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm Mark. This is Dave," he said, gesturing with his clipboard to his silent, hulking partner. "We're with Lakeview Pines HOA Security. We are here to deliver a formal and final stop work order. You are to cease all activities on this structure immediately and vacate the premises until the board says otherwise." He made a little show of checking a box on his clipboard. A flourish of performative bureaucracy. On what grounds? I asked, crossing my arms and standing my ground. On the grounds of repeated flagrant violations of the community's CCNRs, Mark said, puffing out his thin chest. You have ignored multiple notices, failed to pay fines, and continued with an unapproved project that is considered a blight on this community. A blight? I repeated, my voice dangerously low. This cabin was a collapsing wreck when I bought it. A genuine hazard. I'm saving it from ruin. The committee did not approve your plans, he recited, his eyes fixed on his clipboard as if he were reading from a script. Therefore, any work you perform is unauthorized. If you do not comply, the HOA is prepared to take further legal action, including placing a lien on your property and initiating foreclosure proceedings. This was the escalation I had been expecting. The final threat. They weren't just trying to stop my work. They were threatening to take my home. You're on my private property, I said, my voice dropping even further. And you are not law enforcement. You have no actual authority here. You're security guards for a book club. We are authorized agents of the Homeowners Association, of which you are a contractually bound member, Mark shot back, his confidence wavering just a little at my tone. That's when I pulled out my phone and hit the record button, holding it up where he could clearly see the red light. For the record, I said, my voice now clear and projecting. Please state your full names and the specific legal authority you believe you have to order me to stop work on my own land. They both looked startled, like I had just produced a snake. Dave, the big guy, unconsciously took a half step back. Mark's face flushed a blotchy red. You can't record me, he stammered, his officiousness evaporating into panic. Actually, I can, I said calmly. I'd been reading up on my rights as a homeowner. I am a party to this conversation, and we are on my property. Now, for the recording, what is your legal authority to be here? Mark sputtered for a moment, his eyes darting from my phone to his partner. We represent the HOA. You have to follow the rules of the community. And I have a right not to be harassed and threatened on my own land, I retorted. You've delivered your order. I've received it. I am now officially telling you to leave my property. Dave looked at Mark, his expression clearly saying that this was way above his pay grade. But Mark, desperate to regain some semblance of authority, tried to play one last card. This isn't over, Mr. Jensen. The next time, it won't be us. It will be the HOA's lawyers and the sheriff. I'll take my chances, I said, my eyes locked on his. Now leave. They hesitated for a long, tense moment, two actors who had forgotten their lines. Then, with a final pathetic glare from Mark, they turned and walked back to their car. As they drove away, the adrenaline that had been singing through my veins faded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They had threatened my home, my dream, and tried to bully me into submission on my own soil. They had crossed a line. My first stop Monday morning would be the county records office. Margaret's clue was no longer just a hint. It was my mission. The county records office was a dusty, quiet place that smelled like old paper and forgotten time. It was a cathedral of bureaucracy, with shelves of massive binders and rows of clunky old microfilm machines. I spent the first hour just figuring out the archaic filing system, feeling like an archaeologist trying to decipher ancient runes. Following Margaret's advice, I ignored the modern, digitized records and asked the clerk for the physical survey plats from the 1950s and 60s. He led me to a back room filled with large, flat filing cabinets. I pulled the old, hand-drawn county maps from the 1960s, the ones created long before Lakeview Pines was a formal community, and unrolled them on a large table. I carefully compared them to the modern HOA plat map I had been given. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The boundaries seemed to match up. My frustration grew. Maybe Margaret had been mistaken, but I kept digging, going back even further. cabinet by cabinet, year by year. And that's when I found it. It wasn't a map, but a note, a single, typed addendum stapled to a survey map from 1958. The map detailed the sale of a large tract of forest from a timber company to the developer who would eventually create the Lakeview Pines community. But the addendum described an exception, a carve-out from the main sale. A small, 5-acre parcel, described not by a modern lot number, but by its old geographic markers. From the old lightning-struck oak tree on the ridge, south to the granite bluff overlooking the lake, was explicitly and legally excluded from the sale. It was listed as a pre-existing private non-conforming lot with dwelling. My heart started hammering against my ribs. It felt like a jolt of electricity. I rushed over to one of the public-use computers and pulled up the modern digital tax assessor's map for my lot number. I toggled on the satellite view and the old survey overlays. I cross-referenced the coordinates, my hands trembling slightly as I typed. There was no doubt. The lightning-struck oak was still there, at the corner of my property. The granite bluff was the one right below my cabin. My cabin, my 5 acres, was the exact parcel of land that had been excluded from that original sale 60 years ago. It was a grandfather clause, an unbreakable one, buried in decades of paperwork. The developer who created Lakeview Pines had never actually owned my land. He had built the community around it. This meant he had no legal right whatsoever to include my property in the HOA's founding governing documents. My property was an island, completely independent of their authority. For decades, the HOA had been operating under a false assumption, or, more likely, had just absorbed my property onto their maps over the years, counting on the fact that no one would ever dig deep enough to notice. Every threatening letter, every absurd fine, every ounce of harassment they had directed at me wasn't just an overstep of their authority. It was fundamentally, legally fraudulent. Carol Aldridge wasn't a queen. She was a pretender to a throne that didn't exist. And I had just found the certified, undeniable evidence to prove it. This was the secret weapon. This was the backfire. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated rage. I wanted to drive straight to Carol Aldridge's perfectly manicured house, bang on her door, and slap the certified county maps on her smug face. But I held back. A public shouting match would be emotionally satisfying for a moment, but it wasn't strategic. She would just deny, deflect, and hire lawyers. She would try to drag it out in court, burying me in legal fees until I was broke. No, I had to do this my way. This couldn't just be a victory. It had to be a lesson. I needed to build a trap, piece by meticulous piece, using their own tactics against them. I went home and drafted a formal letter to the board. But it wasn't a letter of defiance. It was a letter of complete and utter surrender. I wrote that, with great regret, I could no longer afford the mounting fines and the legal threats. I stated that I was requesting a public hearing with the full HOA board. The purpose of the hearing, I wrote, was to appeal for a reduction in the fines based on financial hardship, and to formally request a variance of hardship that would allow me to complete a board-approved version of my restoration using their hideous, pre-approved materials. I was playing their game, using their own soulless bureaucratic language. It was a masterpiece of groveling. I knew Carol couldn't possibly resist. A public hearing where the defiant rebel has to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness in front of the entire community? It was a power tripper's ultimate fantasy. It would be her glorious victory lap, the final confirmation of her absolute power. As I had predicted, I received a response in just 2 days. The board, via a letter dripping with condescension from Carol, graciously granted my request for a hearing on the following Wednesday evening. My next step was to quietly meet with a real estate attorney I found in the next town over. I didn't want anyone from our local area who might have ties to the HOA. I presented him with the entire, neatly organized binder, the 1958 survey plat, the addendum, my property deed tracing its lineage back to 1922, and the HOA's articles of incorporation. I didn't tell him my theory. I just asked a simple question. From a legal standpoint, what is the relationship between this property and this HOA? He spent about 30 minutes reviewing everything, his expression unreadable. Finally, he took off his glasses, looked at me, and a slow smile spread across his face. From a legal standpoint, Mr. Jensen, he said, there is no relationship. They have zero jurisdiction over you. Any fines they've levied, any rules they've tried to impose are null and void. In fact, you likely have a very strong case for harassment and financial damages. My final move was the most delicate. I went door to door, inviting my neighbors to the public hearing. I was polite, a little sheepish, the picture of a defeated man. I told them that the HOA had finally beaten me, and that I was going to plead my case and hope for the best. To Bill, I said, I just hope I can convince them to let me stay and finish the project without going bankrupt. To the Perfect Lawn couple, I said, you were right. I should have just followed the rules from the start. I was carefully, deliberately painting a picture of my own public humiliation, ensuring that the room would be packed for Carol's big show. I wanted witnesses, lots of them. The community clubhouse was packed. It was standing room only. Just as I'd hoped, it seemed almost everyone from Lakeview Pines was there to see the show. The final, public execution of the troublemaker. I saw Bill in the back, giving me a small, sympathetic nod. I saw the Perfect Lawn couple in the front row, looking smug and vindicated. And at the head table, flanked by her stone-faced board members, sat Carol Aldridge, radiating a level of self-satisfaction that was almost palpable. She was glowing with it. She called the meeting to order and immediately launched into her prepared statement. She laid out the case against me, speaking for nearly 20 minutes. She detailed every single violation, from the infamous blue tarp to the unauthorized soil disturbance to the unseemly pile of lumber. She spoke in grand terms about her duty to protect the aesthetic integrity and property values of their precious community. She painted me as a reckless, arrogant outsider who had nothing but contempt for the rules that held their society together. When she finally finished her tirade, she looked at me with a cruel little smile. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice dripping with mock sincerity, "the floor is yours. We are all very interested to hear your appeal." I walked slowly to the podium at the front of the room, carrying a single thin file folder. I took a deep breath. "Thank you, Carol, and the board, for granting me this opportunity to speak," I began, my voice calm, steady, and amplified by the small microphone. "First, I'd like to address the violations and the fines." For the next 10 minutes, I calmly and methodically dismantled their entire case. I presented a signed affidavit from a materials expert confirming that hand-split cedar shakes were not only historically accurate, but were the premium, most desirable roofing for a cabin of this era. I presented the relevant county building codes, showing that my structural stabilization work was not only legal, but absolutely necessary to prevent a collapse. I showed time-stamped photos of my lumber pile, which was, in fact, a neat, professional stack of wood, and contrasted it with photos of the board's own approved construction sites, which were far messier. With each point I made, I saw looks of confusion, then dawning comprehension on the faces in the audience. This wasn't the speech of a beaten man. Carol's smile tightened into a thin, hard line. "That's all very interesting, Mr. Jensen," she cut in, her voice sharp with impatience. "But it doesn't change the simple fact that you are bound by the CC&Rs of this association, whether you agree with them or not." "Ah, the CC&Rs," I said, pausing for a beat to let the anticipation build. "I'm so glad you brought those up." I reached into my folder and pulled out a large, certified copy of the 1958 County Survey Plat. I walked over and laid it on the table directly in front of her. "I've been doing some reading of my own," I said, my voice now loud enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. "And I found this. It's the original survey plat for the land purchase that became Lakeview Pines. And as you can see, right here, I pointed to the clearly marked cross-hatched exclusion zone. My 5-acre lot, Lot 72, was explicitly and legally excluded from the land tract that was used to form this community. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Carol stared at the map, her brow furrowed. I pulled out the next document from my folder, my own property deed. And this is my deed, which traces its title all the way back to 1922, long before this HOA ever existed. It has never, at any point in its history, been legally annexed into your association. I turned away from the board and addressed the audience directly. What this means, I said, letting my voice ring with conviction, is that for years, the Lakeview Pines HOA has been asserting authority over a property it has absolutely no legal jurisdiction over. Every fine they've levied against me, every stop work order, every threat of foreclosure has been fraudulent. The room was dead silent. Carol stared at the map, her face turning from smug red to a pasty, sick-looking white. She had been caught, publicly and undeniable. This has to be a mistake, she stammered, looking desperately at her board members for support. But they were all staring at the map in dawning horror, realizing the magnitude of the liability I had just exposed. It's no mistake, I said, my voice as cold and hard as ice. It's a certified county record. Your association, Carol, under your leadership, has been engaging in illegal harassment and attempted extortion, and I have documented every single threat and every fraudulent fine. And I'm sure, I said, looking out at the stunned faces of my neighbors, that I'm not the only one here who has been pushed around by this board. That's when the dam broke. A very old man stood up shakily. They fined me $200 because my mailbox was leaning half an inch. A woman in the third row shouted, "They made me rip out my entire rose garden because the specific variety wasn't on the approved list." The room suddenly erupted in a chorus of long-suppressed grievances, a wave of anger and resentment washing over the board. The spell of fear that Carol had woven for years was finally, irrevocably broken. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the board. The meeting descended into chaos, with residents shouting over one another, all their pent-up frustrations unleashed. Carol and the board sat stunned and silent, completely overwhelmed. Within a few weeks, facing undeniable proof and a full-blown homeowner revolt, the HOA's own lawyer was forced to issue a formal letter confirming my findings. It was a complete legal surrender. The board was forced to issue a public, written apology, formally rescind all fines they had ever levied against me, and, most importantly, record a new plat map with the county that officially acknowledged my property as fully independent. Carol Aldridge resigned in disgrace, selling her house and moving away within 2 months. The rest of the board was unceremoniously voted out in an emergency election. A new group of homeowners was voted in, led by none other than Bill, the man with the rose garden. Their first act was to promise a complete overhaul of the draconian rulebook and a new era of transparency and reason. My sweet revenge wasn't suing them into oblivion. Though my lawyer assured me I had an open and shut case, my victory was quieter and far more satisfying. It was the sound of my hammer echoing through the pine trees, with no one to tell me to stop. It was the deep satisfaction of installing the last custom-milled, historically accurate window frame, letting the afternoon sun stream into the cabin. It was the freedom of standing on my own roof, nailing down the last hand-split cedar shake, its beautiful, non-regulation surface glinting in the sun. Every act of restoration was a quiet act of defiance and victory. Over the next 6 months, I finished the project. The cabin was breathtaking. It became something of a local landmark, a testament to what was possible with passion and dedication. It was a quiet, powerful symbol of a victory won not with shouting and anger, but with diligent research, strategic patience, and a simple refusal to be bullied. Neighbors would stop by now, not with complaints or suspicious glares, but with genuine admiration and curiosity. The community, once a place of fear and conformity, was slowly starting to feel like a real community. And my cabin, my dream, rescued from both rot and regulation, stood proudly at the heart of it all. And that's the story of how my dream cabin restoration turned into a war with a power-hungry HOA, and how a 60-year-old secret buried in a dusty file cabinet brought their entire rotten structure to a halt. It just goes to show you that knowledge truly is power. Standing up for your rights can feel intimidating, especially when you feel alone. But sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to challenge the system for the whole thing to come tumbling down. Now I have to ask you, have you ever had a run-in with a crazy HOA? What's the most petty rule you've ever had to deal with? I really want to hear your stories, so let me know down in the comments. I read every single one, and if you enjoyed this story, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps the channel out and ensures you won't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.